All right. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, a very special guest. He comes to us from the UK. His name is Awan. I interviewed him about his book, The Libya Conspiracy, which you can find on his website, burningblogger.com. It's BURNINGBLOGGER.com. And really had a great discussion with him back in 2017. And the Libya disaster really isn't something that's even mentioned on the American corporate media. So that was really worthwhile to listen to that. And I recommend people go listen to that as well. But I asked him to come back on the show. I reached out to him to talk about the Middle East. There was a lot going on in the Middle East. And he's written a number of articles about that. So we're going to talk about that and maybe kind of his deplatforming experience that happened in 2019 too. But anyway, so Awan, are you there?
I'm here, yeah.
Awesome.
Hi, William.
Hi. Thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not have heard of you, can you talk a little bit about your background, what led you to write the Libya Conspiracy, and then a little bit about what is going on in the Middle East, considering this conflict between Israel, Hamas, and Palestinian movement?
Sure. Yeah. In terms of background, I have some very minor background in journalism, some being published in certain magazines and publications and stuff a long time ago. But really, I set up my blog so that I could start writing kind of unencumbered by, other people's concerns and limitations and stuff. And the Libya thing just was something that really caught my attention because I knew I had done a lot of reading about Libya and the Gaddafi era. So when that stuff was happening in 2011, I was very interested in it and very skeptical. So I was just, and it was pretty evident that there was a lot of dishonesty going on. So that inspired me to write that book and to put it up on the site. And then everything really just flows from there. My interest in the Middle East and, the Arab world and the politics and the war on terror and all this stuff and the history of it. It's all extremely complex and interesting. And, there's so much beneath the surface to all that stuff.
Well, there's a lot that happening here too. I mean, we hear about this, what is it, the Abrahamic agreements and all these things that are happening that are supposedly can bring peace, so-called peace to the Middle East. But what's your opinion kind of on everything that happened under the Trump administration and then this new kind of conflict that built up? Can you talk about the background and then how that applies to the current events?
In terms of the Trump administration, I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but I always saw Trump as a Zionist. I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say a Zionist puppet, but certainly a Zionist agent, I guess, and certainly Jared Kushner was, without doubt. So even if Trump wasn't, then he still was because of Jared Kushner in any case.
Right.
And we know that Kushner was extremely close to Netanyahu, that they were roommates at one point, I think. So that they lived together.
I think his dad, let Netanyahu stay at his house. So there's family connections, yeah.
Yeah, and then you look at, and then Kushner was funding some of the illegal settlements, some of the illegal Zionist settlements in the Palestinian occupied territories. He was pumping money into that. So was Steve Bannon. He was pumping money into the illegal settlements. And with Steve Bannon, I don't really understand the philosophy behind it, or because that seems odd. With Kushner, I get it, but so there's all these obvious connections, and like Trump was so overtly and excessively pro Netanyahu and pro Israel for most of his tenure. I know most American presidents are, but not necessarily that overtly or to that extent. And recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which was something that no one had done before because it was seen as a step too far. And, it would cause too many problems, too much provocation, and it was questionable under international law because that whole occupied area is supposed to be essentially like under international or jurisdiction or something. So it's not like Israel can't claim it, let alone claim it as a capital, So there's all of that, and so Trump was definitely pro Netanyahu and pro Zionist, and he had a habit as well of getting rid.
A habit of what?
deal, a lot of it seemed to stem from his from Netanyahu's dislike of the nuclear deal. So Trump almost became an extension of Netanyahu, in terms of foreign policy and the position towards Iran and all that stuff. So and with Biden, with the transition now to Biden, I don't know where he stands on this stuff. I can't get a reading on it at all. So.
But what were your thoughts about this kind of Abrahamic agreement? Do you think it's something that is long-standing, or do you think that it's just going to what's your position on that, and kind of what's Israel's position with, or do you have any thoughts about Israel's position with Iran?
So are you talking about the peace deal then? The
yes,
peace plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I find, what's really curious about that peace plan is that it focuses a lot on certain states like Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, and I think Egypt might be involved in it. It completely eliminates Jordan from the equation entirely, which is really odd because Jordan is a really close ally of the United States, and Jordan has been very cooperative in terms of US foreign policy and Western foreign policy. So you would think that Jordan would be, would be given a seat at the table, but they weren't. And it's really curious because clearly one of the reasons why Jordan were excluded and they weren't happy about it is there's something, that a lot of people don't know, which is that those sites in Jerusalem, the holy sites, so the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque,
right.
the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Christian sites as well, are under the custodianship of the King of Jordan. He's responsible for those sites, and all of those Palestinian worshippers and communities and stuff. They rely on the King Abdullah's protection to a large extent, and his custodianship of those sites, which he takes very seriously. So the fact that this peace plan just excluded Jordan entirely is from the outset was very curious, especially then because very soon after that you had this flare up at the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the Temple Mount, which is
right.
Specifically where all this stuff, this war between Israel and Gaza recently kicked off. That's what triggered it.
Right.
And he was and the Jordanian government, like in the weeks, I think maybe a few weeks before that, were issuing warnings to the Israelis to stop their provocations in that area, to stop provoking like the worshippers in that area. So they were even aware that something was probably being planned, and there was some deliberate provocation going on to kind of ignite some kind of incident, or conflict. And then you go back to because this stuff was happening, I guess, in May. But if you go back to April, there was this strange anomaly there was this brief instability in Jordan where there was a plot to overthrow the king, right? And I don't know how much that got reported in the United States.
I'm not aware of that at all. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there was basically it was shrouded in kind of mystery because there hasn't been a clear explanation for what happened. But basically, the government arrested a bunch of people, ministers, as well as one of the crown princes, because they said for national security, because these people were actively involved in a plot to destabilize Jordan and to overthrow the king, King Abdullah. So that's interesting because that was maybe less than a month before the stuff kicked off in Jerusalem. But then also when you start looking into some of the newspaper coverage from around that time and from even earlier, there's all this stuff going on with like even in the Israeli media they were talking about, there's no place left for the King of Jordan in our equation. And, these are actual quotes. I mean, I can't give you the exact quote right now, but they were basically saying King Abdullah doesn't have a future in Jordan, and he's not, he needs to go, basically. So, so they're saying that, and then you have this, and then you have the deal of the century in the background of this, from which Jordan is excluded, and then you have the plot in Jordan to destabilize the country, and then you have, shortly after the Al-Aqsa thing and like the Israel-Gaza conflict. So it seems pretty clear that I think it seems pretty clear that the Israelis were behind whatever was going on in Jordan, and that they just about managed to nip it in the bud,
Interesting. And I mean, that he is actually a blood relative of Muhammad, that guy, King Abdullah. He comes from the Hashemites. He's actually a blood ancestor of the original prophet. But he's also very
Yeah,
Western. Sorry.
he's extremely Western. Yeah. He's I mean, I don't know if you saw on the site, I made a joke about it, but he's a big Western. He's a big American, big fan of American culture and stuff. He was in an episode of Star Trek Voyager. He had a little cameo because he was a big fan of the show and all that kind of stuff.
I
He's
think his
very
wife was
modern.
American, if I remember. There's a lot of connections between him and the States.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
you can please continue.
That family are direct descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So if I can just take just a slight detour, just to
Please do. Yeah.
go into that. So it's really interesting because basically that family, the Hashemite family, is the family in the Arab world that has the kind of pedigree and the lineage and stuff like that, and for a long time the respect of various tribes and stuff because of that, by virtue of that bloodline, and also by virtue of the fact that they seem to have just genuinely been respected in terms of how they conducted themselves over the years and all that kind of stuff. And then so in World War One, they were the main. It was basically that family that started the Arab revolt.
The Arab revolt, right.
I mean, have you seen the film Lawrence of Arabia? Because
yes, of course.
Yeah. So that goes. So Prince Faisal, Alec Guinness's character. That's
and that's your icon. There is T.E. Lawrence, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So they were the family with the pedigree, and they fought on the side of the British, and they were promised by the British. They were promised an independent Arab state, after the war, in exchange for their fighting on the side of the British, right? And then what happened was, after the war, the French and the British drew up a separate agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they basically carved up the Middle East, according to their own colonial kind of interests and what they wanted out of which country and all that kind of stuff. So the independent Arab state never materialized, even though it was
promised, right? That was the promise. It was Faisal, right? Wasn't that was his grandfather or father? So it's King Faisal, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating.
And that was the whole basis of them, fighting the war and laying down their lives and all this kind of stuff. So instead, the British, for reasons that I still don't understand, they decided to they decided to basically give the main part of Arabia to the House of Saud, which was a family that didn't have any pedigree or any kind of lineage or anything like that. They were just some random tribe, some random house that were one of the tribes in Arabia. And so the House of Saud got the biggest part of Arabia, and they got, they were installed by the British, and they got custodianship of the Muslim holy sites of Medina and Mecca, which had been under the Hashemites prior to that. They were called the Sharifs, the sheriffs of Mecca, because they were the descendants of Muhammad. They had automatic kind of right to be the custodians of those sites. So what happened after the First World War is the House of Saud got Saudi Arabia and all those holy cities, but in Jerusalem, they actually requested that the Hashemites take over custodianship of those holy sites, the Christian sites and the Muslim sites in Jerusalem, because with the Zionists and all that sort of coming in, there was this big fear about being overtaken and buildings being demolished and things not being respected and all of that. So that family was that respected that they were basically, it was requested of them to come and take over custodianship, and that has remained the case all these years to now, and it's still the case. But then if you go to the peace plan, Kushner's peace plan and all that stuff, there was something I was reading in the Israeli media where they were talking about one of the kind of unspoken things in there. One of the things that's implied is the idea of transferring that custodianship over to Saudi Arabia and taking it away from Jordan, so that the Saudis can have control of.
The Saudis are a little bit more friendly with the Israelis than Jordan, and the West Bank was 67 war was occupied. So you can see why they would want to do something like that and elbow out Jordan.
Yeah, because I think the Jordanians are seen as being kind of fair and neutral. Not, you can watch interviews with like the patriarch of the church in Jerusalem, the Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, basically saying that if it wasn't for the King of Jordan, that they wouldn't have a leg to stand on. That they would have they can't rely on the UN or like the British or the Americans or anyone to be like a protector or a fair kind of arbitrator or anything like that. All they've got is the King of Jordan, because he's protecting those sites, including the Church of the Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, all these places.
Right. And those, I've heard that the Israelis are trying to kind of elbow them out by raising taxes on them. Have you heard that story? So they're trying to tax them. So it's actually pretty precarious, because if the authority of the Hashemite kingdom ever gets removed from those West Bank holy sites, and the Israelis really take power in some future conflict, that whole Holy Land will erupt. Also, would just change the whole dynamic of what's going on right there in Jerusalem.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to go too much into stuff like messianic prophecy and stuff like that, because I don't know, that gets a bit weird. But as I understand it, the whole idea is that Jerusalem becomes the capital not just of Israel but of the world. It becomes like the center of world peace, and it becomes like the capital of a new era or something like that. So it's really important to them, obviously, like to the Zionists, but it's also important to, I mean, it goes into interesting areas, because it's also important to Freemasonry, and it's also important to Knights Templar mythology and all that kind of stuff. Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and all that history. And
right, I think you mentioned in your article that the Temple Mount was the Templars' headquarters, right? It was right there in Jerusalem too, and they're still around. I mean, Freemasonry and Jacques de Molay, so that history, still present. You said that those guys, some of those white far right serial killer guys, Terrence and Brevik, were heavily involved in that mythology, symbology. I think you said that Terrence had to go or got a blessing from the Reef Nude Templars or something like that to do his massacre.
Yeah, it's all really, really odd and curious. But yeah, he said that. But then I think the judge in the trial basically said that organization that he's referring to doesn't exist. So it was all like a figment of his imagination or something. But even if it was, it's still interesting that he has that in his psychology.
His symbolism is a new Templar, and he has that cross, the cross of Jerusalem, right? The red one or something like that. So yeah. But it is interesting. I mean, so it's really still precarious there. This whole conflict between Gaza and the Israelis, and there's just all kinds of things are going on. Like what is the situation now? Are you familiar with this guy Naftali Bennett, or how the change of power is taking place in Israel?
Yeah, no, I mean, I know who he is, but I'm not. I know he's a very hard line. He's a hawk pretty much, but I don't know that he would be much better than Netanyahu, but I'm not sure exactly what's going on with Netanyahu, why they've decided, after all this time, that he had to go. I mean, maybe enough of the neutral Israeli population were so fed up of Netanyahu that they just thought it's just better to let him go and start fresh with someone else.
He's not out of the woods either, right? Doesn't he have a couple criminal cases or pending? Corruption cases?
Yeah, I guess he's in a Trump-like situation in a way.
Right.
So
good point.
Yeah.
Right. And so what else did you write about? You have this other one, that's the Al-Aqsa. Why did Israel create Hamas? Can you explain the creation of Hamas and why it's beneficial to the Zionists?
Yeah, well, so Hamas basically it evolved from the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is it seems to be like the prototype of like all Islamic extremist kind of groups, including Al Qaeda and whoever else. Ideologically, they all seem to descend from the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hamas was like a relatively small kind of faction. And what happened around sort of the late 1980s and 1990s is there was this whole thing going on with Israel basically covertly trying to build up Hamas, and help them to kind of gain more kind of prominence in Palestinian culture and politics and stuff.
Right, over the PLO, right? Over the Palestinian Liberation.
Yeah, so you had the PLO, and the PLO was basically a secular national movement to create a national, a Palestinian nation. So that they were secular. They were, they had Christians in there in leadership roles, and they had Muslims and they had atheists, and religion really had nothing to do with it. And in a sense, that was a problem because that created more kind of international sympathy for the Palestinian movement, because they weren't, extremists or fundamentalists or anything like that, and also because they were open to peace. Yasser Arafat basically renounced terrorism in the late 70s, I think. So as soon as he did that, that was a problem because you can't, if you're Israel and you're trying to have this enemy to justify the things you need to do, when your enemy then renounces terrorism and says, okay, let's negotiate, let's have peace, we're not going to do violent stuff anymore, and and then I think he even got the Nobel Peace Prize in the mid 1990s or something. So him and the PLO had become like a real problem propaganda wise, because they were gaining way too much sympathy abroad, and that wasn't helping Israel's agenda or the Zionist agenda at all. So the implication is that the policy, the kind of covert policy, then became to build up Hamas, have them kind of take over the Palestinian movement, so that we could return to terrorism versus democracy, or like the paradigm of the good guys versus the bad guys, rather than this kind of equal footing kind of thing. Right. So yeah, I mean, if you look at, there's actual quotes from Israeli. I think I have the quotes written down somewhere, but there's actual quotes from Israeli, like the Israeli governor of Gaza in the 1980s, basically came out and said in an interview with, I think, either the Washington Post or the New York Times, he said that essentially they helped create Hamas, and they did it as to create a counterbalance to the secularists of the PLO. Right. So Avner Cohen is his name, and he was a former Israeli official, and he told the Wall Street Journal in 2009, Hamas is Israel's creation. He just came out and said it. Right. And then you've got the Israeli military governor of Gaza in the 1980s was a Brigadier General Yitzhak Segev, I think, and he told the New York Times that he had helped to finance the Islamists, basically to replace the PLO secularists. So it's spelled out from like the mouths of actual Israeli military people and political people who've just come out and said it. They said, we created Hamas, to suit our purposes. So you kind of have to assume that whatever's going on now, or periodically with Hamas, is also just part of that same purpose, that same agenda,
Right. You create your enemies is the best way to do it, right? Create your own enemies. So.
Because then you can justify whatever you need to do. You can't do that if your enemy's peaceful,
And Netanyahu himself, there's been times these conflicts that have benefited him, right? So I can't remember, there were some, even this conflict supposedly could have benefited him as a kind of a right-wing hardliner, right? Keep him in power, but didn't seem to work this time. But I vaguely remember in the past that he has benefited from some of these terrorist acts, right, to stay in power. Yeah. Are you familiar with that? Or?
Yeah. It's a similar thing that happens with a lot of false flag stuff as well, where it's just someone's benefiting from it, like it's serving a purpose. And propaganda wise for Netanyahu, it was helping like every time, because he looked like the big tough guy protecting Israel's interests and the citizens and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, but also the extent to which a lot of the Palestinian kind of terrorism over the years was being covertly sponsored by Israeli, by Mossad or by Israeli intelligence and stuff like that. There was an arms dealer, an IDF, Israeli Defense Forces arms dealer named Ari Ben Menash or something, and he published a book basically talking about, highlighting a number of these cases where Palestinian terror attacks, particularly abroad, were being basically helped along by Israeli intelligence operatives, because they wanted this stuff to happen, because propaganda wise, internationally, every time that happened, it really helped, Israel, like to have the high ground and to have the sympathy and the support. So
right. So he's saying, Ben Menash is saying that the attack on the Kili Loro was a secret operation. Yeah. So people got bribed, people got paid. And then you talk, Abu Nadal was supposedly like this great terrorist guy, right? But isn't he also have a kind of an intel background?
So yeah, I mean, he's like an amazing figure. I mean, they absolutely should make a film, a Hollywood movie about him at some point, because he was like, so he was like the most brutal Palestinian terrorist, right? Supposedly. Um, he was the one that even like other Palestinian terrorists were like, oh my God, what is this guy doing? And but then like, so a book was written about him, and a lot of research was done into him. An author named Patrick Seal wrote a book about him called Abu Nidal, Gun for Hire, where basically he exposes that this guy Nidal was working for Mossad at one point, directly for the Israelis. Even while he was carrying out Palestinian terror attacks. So it's like, it's the same thing of like, you're creating basically the same brutal attacks that you're then using to justify what you're going to do in retaliation and all that kind of stuff. But then also, Nidal, like he was like a quadruple agent or something. He was everywhere. I mean, he was working for the Syrian government at one point, and then he was working against the Syrian government. Then he was in Libya, but it wasn't clear whether he was working for the Libyans or against the Libyans, for someone else. Then he ended up in Iraq, and essentially Saddam's people went to his apartment and killed him when the American-led invasion was happening in 2003, because they were convinced that he was working for the Americans. So yeah, it's extraordinary kind of.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think you write in your article that all of these so-called Palestinian terror attacks actually hurt the movement more than benefit, right? So that's also very odd.
Yeah, absolutely. And logically, anyone can see that as well, because it's. I mean, if you just take all this stuff that Hamas does, that's the mantra every time. It's Hamas is firing rockets though, so we have to do this stuff because they're firing rockets. Well, you could have had someone who wasn't firing rockets, 20 years ago. They weren't firing rockets at you, the PLO or Arafat. They were trying to negotiate. So you can't have it both. You can't cite the rockets as like the blanket justification for everything, but you had the peacemakers who were at the table, and you didn't tolerate them either. So
right. Well, there's like an interesting, I think that during Netanyahu, the peacemaker here was Mitchell, right? There's actually a picture of Netanyahu, Mitchell, Hillary Clinton, and the PLO guy whose name I can't remember, but Mitchell was caught up in the whole Epstein thing. So this girl, Virginia Giuffre, said that she had relationships with Mitchell when she was underage. And so then you have this guy sitting there in the peace process, right? Supposed peace process. But you write that too. So you talk about some intel movements, but you talk about how there's the two-state solution's pretty much a goner. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that pretty much died with Yasser Arafat in 2003 or 2002, whenever it was. So if you remember that, I mean, basically, if you go back to I'm guessing like the mid-90s, when the famous picture of Bill Clinton with Arafat and the other the Israeli leader.
Was it Rabin?
Yeah, I think it was Rabin. Yeah. So it was heralded as this huge moment, this big moment of the path to peace and all of that, and that all just got destroyed, and it didn't get destroyed really by the Palestinians, because they were just basically waiting on Israel and then the Americans and the international community to kind of carry this thing forward. What happened was,
that picture right there. Do you see that picture?
There you go. Yeah. That's the picture, the famous picture. Rabin was assassinated by a Zionist extremist whose name I can't remember, but they said he was like a lone nut,
supposedly a lone wolf that was able to get close enough to put the gun right behind him. Right?
And Arafat, they said originally that he died of natural causes, but then a subsequent investigation found that he had died from polonium poisoning, from nuclear material and stuff. So he was almost certainly assassinated. But essentially how it ended for him was in 2003, the Israelis basically just started bombarding his compound in occupied Jerusalem. No, in the West Bank. Sorry, in the West Bank. Right. They just began, they surrounded him. They just started bulldozing structures and buildings, and he was trapped in basically, I think, 2 or 3 rooms in one building. and they were just waiting him out, for, I think it went on for months at a time, just like he couldn't leave, people couldn't really enter, and then eventually he died, supposedly of natural causes, but it since turned out it was poisoning. So I think that was basically that was it for the two-state solution and for the peace process. And then after that, it really became the rise of Hamas and the kind of radicalization of the Palestinian movement, or at least how we perceive it abroad. We perceive it as like an Islamist movement now, when it wasn't really, certainly not for a very long time.
Right. And so that two-state solution's probably dead, and they're slowly encroaching. I mean, we talked about illegal settlements and these weird walls they're basically creating kind of an apartheid state. I mean, to me, it's apartheid state. But why isn't the international community really trying to put a halt to that? Because I don't perceive that happening. Do you?
No. There's something very odd that happens when it comes to Israel, and it's very strange. Like, in terms of the British and the Americans, they have a permanent kind of bias towards Israel. But in terms of other countries, it's just very odd, because, I mean, for starters, you have the UN situation, which is, in a lot of cases, you'll get the vast majority of the delegations will vote, for example, to impose sanctions on the Israeli government for their illegal settlements and stuff. But then, the British or the Americans will just veto it. So that happens pretty much every time. So that's one problem. But then there's this strange thing with Israel where, like, so for example, you had like the government in New Zealand, basically, that they voted to recognize a Palestinian state. And then Netanyahu got angry and he threatened them. I can't remember his exact words, but he threatened them. He said, anyone who sides against Israel, will regret it or something. And then like a week later, Christchurch happened, and it's just weird stuff like that where you kind of look at it and you think, what's really going on there is there, there's a surface level, and then there's another level, and then there's probably another level beneath that of stuff going on. And I don't know if there's a lot of governments who are scared of Israel, or who are scared of the way Israel is able to act in terms of covert operations and stuff like that. Because and then you can even tie all that stuff back towards the Epstein stuff, as all that kind of stuff as well. Right. I mean, there's a whole.
There was kind of a scandal in New Zealand, I think in the 90s or maybe after the millennium, but they had Israeli assets, faking passports and things like that. And there was a big kerfuffle, if I remember correctly, because these guys were using fake names. And so they were kind of abusing the system there. And so that was interesting. But then this whole Brenton Tarrant of Christchurch, I think he just got sentenced. I mean, he finally got sentenced within the last month or two, right?
Mm.
So yeah, that was just, that whole legal proceeding just ended, and yeah. I mean,
and he had been in Israel, right? I'm trying to remember that case, but he had definitely been in Israel.
Yeah, he'd been in Israel. He had traveled around. I think his dad passed away, left him money, and he traveled around, and so did Brevik, right? Didn't you write that Brevik went to Israel?
Yeah, Brevik was extremely pro-Zionist, openly as well. Yeah.
God, it's really remarkable. Yeah.
But that thing, I mean, have you heard of someone called Tommy Robinson? Do you know who that is?
Yeah.
So he's this guy in the UK, and he's supposed to be this, this kind of, salt of the earth, kind of one of the lads, like standing up for, British, I don't know. He's that patriotic kind of, typical patriot. And then you look into his background, and he's like, so he's massively pro-Zionist as well, and he's linked to like people like Pamela Geller and Richard Spencer and all this stuff. And he was getting funding from Israeli linked organizations and like Daniel Pipes and people like that. So there was weird stuff going on there. And then you see him like, he's like, there's pictures of him wearing like a Mossad t-shirt, just like openly, like proudly. There's photos of him with Israeli tanks on the Syrian border, like in the occupied like Golan Heights on the Syrian border, and he's posing with a rifle. And then you look into like his trial. He was on trial like a few years ago for I think
mortgage fraud. I think it was mortgage fraud, right?
Yeah, there was that. There was another one as well where I think he tried to enter the United States on a fake passport,
Okay.
and so he was on trial for that. And like apparently he'd been given the fake passport by Pamela Geller. Right?
Oh, wow.
So
But there's Tommy Robinsons here in the States. There's people here who get tons of funding through Israeli affiliated groups. You'd be surprised. Like some numbers are huge, like 4 figures. So some of these public people are being propped up by very wealthy people.
But you try and explain this to all Tommy Robinson's fanboys and stuff, and they won't hear it. They don't care. I mean, I'm trying to explain, he's not what you think he is. You're raising him up as like one thing, and he's not that at all. There's all kinds of other stuff going on.
I mean, I don't want to name names here in the States, but there's people like that here too. So people who are friends with Robinson, probably in that same network. These are assets, so to speak. They're not independent. Is probably a better way to say it.
But it's the thing with the passports as well, because at his trial, the judge said one of the weirdest things I've ever heard in a trial, which is he basically said, we're going to try you. We're going to prosecute you under your real name, which is, I think it's Stephen Yaxley Lennon. Yeah. But the passport was in a different name, but it wasn't Tommy Robinson. It was a different name. Right. And then Tommy Robinson, the name Tommy Robinson didn't even come up in the trial. So it was just the weirdest thing. And then he literally said something. I think he said, as for your real name, that will not be known outside of private, I don't know, the private hearing or something like that. So it would never be made public. So bizarre stuff.
That is really bizarre. Did that recently happen?
No, I think this was like 2011 or something like that. It was quite a while back. Yeah, quite a while back.
Yeah. Well, anything else you'd like to cover? I mean, do you want to cover some of this right-winger stuff? I mean, this what is it? This article that you heard about Jerusalem, the Holy War psyop?
Sure. I mean, there is like a whole level of. I mean, there's loads of connections between Israel, between the Zionists and the far right or right wing or even alt right kind of groups and movements and personalities, in Europe and in America and stuff like that. And it's easy to find. I mean, it's like. There was a really long article that I wrote a few years ago where I was kind of looking into the rise of kind of the far right and stuff like that. And I wasn't even looking for Israel connections. That wasn't even on my radar, but I just kept finding them. So then it became a thing about, oh, okay, so why is there all this? Why are there all these links to Israel? And then you find all of these groups. So I mean, Trump, went and made the Jerusalem declaration, and then you look through who else has made that declaration, and you get Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? Who's like, a right-wing pro-military dictatorship guy, and then like the Austrian far right is one of the other parties that went over and made the Jerusalem declaration. That was a party. I think they're called the FPO. They were founded by SS officers, Nazi officers after the Second World War. It's the weirdest stuff. And then you look at all these parties. You look at the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, and they're hugely pro-Zionist, and they've had all these meetings in Israel. The leader of that party, I can't remember her name, but she's Goldman Sachs or ex-Goldman Sachs, just like Steve Bannon was. Right. And then the deputy leader of that party, Beatrix von Storch, is the granddaughter of the man who was basically the final head of state for the Third Reich. It was Hitler's, I think, finance minister, I think. So she's like, it's all really strange. And pretty much every country you look at, that seems to be the case. Where, I mean, Tommy Robinson in the UK, as an example as well, where all these far right groups seem to be funded by Israel or linked to Israeli groups or Israeli organizations. You've got people like Nina Rosenwald, who's like an American millionaire or billionaire. She's like the heiress to like the Sears fortune or something like that. She's like, she funds all of these propaganda groups, these pro-Israeli kind of propaganda organizations that spread viral stuff on Facebook and social media and all that kind of stuff. And then you see these people like you were saying, like the Christchurch guy and Brevik, Anders Brevik, who all seem to be connected to Israel, or to at least like draw some kind of inspiration from Israel and from the Zionists. And it's you can't. It gets to the point where you can't ignore it. Because I was actually trying to ignore it for a while, but then it's like, no, there's no way that all this stuff is coincidental. The far right, the main far right political party in France, the Front National, or the National Front under Marine Le Pen. Well, Marine Le Pen's niece is one of their members of parliament. Her father is a Mossad agent, and he wrote a book about being a Mossad agent. It's just
interesting bedfellows, right?
Sure. I mean, and you would think, that Jewish people, and I try and separate Jewish people from, Israeli or Zion. You kind of have to distinguish what you mean when you say, Zionist or Jewish people or whatever. But you would think that they would have an aversion to that kind of alliance or those kind of,
right. And you highlight right. You highlight Sri Lanka too as kind of possibly some type of false flag. I mean, the deaths happened, but that was how many people died in those bombings? It was hundreds, right?
Yeah, I can't remember how many people died, but there was a terror training drill exercise like a week or two before it, involving the Israeli intelligence or some Israeli agency was involved in Sri Lanka, and that's a red flag straight away because
huge red flag, yeah, for all even in the States too, yeah.
Because Israel also has no real connection to Sri Lanka. I mean, they're not geographically close. They're not geopolitically linked hardly at all. So, like, it's just odd that you had Israeli organizations over there running terror drills. Yeah,
that's incredible. Well, we're at 40 minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap this up, or any? Where can people? You can go to this your blog, which is now burningblogger.com, right?
Yeah, burningblogger.com. That's the new address. Yeah.
And then you have links to YouTube, Twitter, Facebook.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, to be honest, my social media and my YouTube is not very active. All my energy at the moment just goes into the site, into the articles on the site. But yeah, all those links and stuff are there. There's a lot of Israel stuff there, and there's a lot. There's a lot of other stuff. It's all pretty miscellaneous.
Right. You're writing on UFOs too. You've got a bunch of different stuff, cover-ups, conspiracies, but we just covered kind of the Middle East today. And again, it's Awan, and the website is burningblogger.com. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.